Okay, this is the Simplify Groups and Projects Working Group on June 11th. Welcome everyone. So we can jump right in since we only have 30 minutes. Alex sounds like he has something to show us, so we can start there.
Sure. Yep. Yep. I'm a bit better organized this week. I'll try to share the screen. Okay. So from a engineering perspective, there's something going on. This is a diagram of projects and groups sort of pivoting around the namespace entity. And so starting at the very top, you have, can you see my cursor there?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. So starting at the very top, we have a user who owns their own namespace. So that's where sort of a user's project would be kept. And then we have sort of these two large collections of entities, which are very similar to each other. On the right is the group sort of set of entities, and on the left we have project entities. So we have a project and a group. We have project membership, and then we have group membership. And then we have sort of the idea of sharing groups into projects and sharing groups into groups. So, I mean, you can sort of see that visually they are very similar. So I think this is a bit suspect. There's various places through the source code where there's pretty much copy and paste of code between the two, which is always sort of a bit of a smell. So just at a very sort of high conceptual level, I'm kind of straddling between engineering and product, I think. It's hard to sort of talk about one or the other. But so just keeping it very conceptual, looking at projects versus groups, I see a project, and feel free to jump in if you think that I'm not right, or if you've got something to add, please. So I see a project as a container of resources being things like issues or snippets or a repository. The project is a container of members. It is a namespace, even though it's not formally acknowledged as a namespace. It's not sort of connected in our sort of back-end systems to a namespace. It is, for all intents and purposes, a namespace. And it's also subject to hierarchical permissions. And then if we look at what a group is, to me, a group is a container of other groups. It's also a container of projects. And then it's a container of members itself. It's also a namespace, and it also is subject to hierarchical permissions. So if I factor out the common bits between groups and projects, what I think is shared between them is that they both are containers of members. They're both namespaces, and they're both subject to hierarchical permissions. What's unique about each of them is that a group is a container of groups, and it's a container of projects, and a project is a container of resources. And I guess part of the motivation behind this working group is that there's a lot of feature requests requesting pulling resources out of projects and sort of putting them on the group level. So if we follow that through and we say that we have containers in project is a container of resources, and we copy that sort of concept over to a group now being a container of resources, we can then factor that out as being sort of this shared element between groups and projects. And then I don't know what a project is at that point, because everything that a project does is kind of covered by this shared collection here. So I kind of end up with this sort of a picture where we just have a group, the concept of a group that can contain resources, and then I don't know what a project is by that point. So I have some thoughts. They're not set, they're not final. I'm keen to hear your feedback on what I've just presented, but My thinking at the moment is that I don't think we really need a project, or like the idea of a project. I think the real need for a project is sort of in its the sort of the colloquial sense, where so a project is a collection of resources, and it's sort of the way we talk about it. Whereas a group is more of a collection of people or a team. So a possible short-term pathway, and I think that there's caveats all around this. I haven't thought too deeply on it, but I think the short-term pathway, you could potentially use projects only as a resource container, and then perhaps every group has an invisible project behind it, and yeah, all those resources are delegated to the group. So it's kind of hidden, but architecturally, it's held within a project. And I guess the long-term pathway to me, following those sort of that thinking, is that the project architecture kind of disappears and it's superseded by the group architecture. And the projects sort of exist only in naming, sort of in documentation, or maybe in UI, where it's useful to sort of distinguish between like teams and groups of resources. Yeah, so that's about all I got.
Alex, when you, I guess when you use the term resources, and I think when you first started, you kind of said that it exists at the project level. Where does something like epics or milestones fit in? Like, is that which basically exists at the group level at the moment? Would you consider that a resource, or when you kind of use that term, are you specifically talking about something else?
Yeah, I mean, I think about them at the moment as being standalone. So like, yeah, a wiki is just a wiki, and then it kind of exists within some context. So yeah, does that help?
It does. I guess maybe I'll ask a question from the other side then. Like, what makes, if they're unique, what makes the fact that issues aren't? So why are kind of like issues included as in your sort of definition of resources, but something like epics or milestones which exist at the group level aren't? Like, what I don't quite get the differentiation between the two, between like why what one thing are coupled as a resource and the others aren't.
Yeah, the definition is a bit fuzzy. I think there's overlap between the things. So obviously a group is definitely already, so for example, Marcus on the call at the moment, he's I believe a long way through getting wikis from the project level into the group level. But I still consider a wiki as like a resource. It's just sort of a collective term for sort of things you can do. I'm not sure how to define it, but all of those things that make the system kind of useful, I consider a resource.
Okay. To be honest, I mean, my question wasn't sort of challenging. It was probably more reinforcing the point as to, like, there are these things that exist at the epic level as well. At the group level as well, but not at the project level, which I guess you could also classify as resources.
That's right. Yeah. It's hard. There's definitely sort of fuzzy lines around some of these things, which is kind of why I said up front that it's very high level conceptual. It's hard to nail it down.
Okay. No, that makes sense.
I wonder too if that, like, taxonomies or milestones or labels too could have a different treatment, because they might apply throughout the whole tree that is created. Like, we set milestones for all of GitLab, but I imagine there'd be people on projects, marketing projects, things like that, where they would also want to set their own. So it is tricky in terms of how those things would flow through the whole ecosystem.
Well, they kind of already do. Part of the problem is that when we made groups and made the inheritance model and made it so that subgroup projects in the subgroup of a parent group, where the labels are defined at the parent group, the project can apply those labels. but right now those labels don't show up in the label list. And so what happens is folks create duplicate labels. You can't set them as priority labels. So like they already exist, and like the projects already have access to any label that is created above it. And I think that's part of what I'm hoping that we can work towards fixing, is by combining these things, we can focus on a better experience for things flowing up and down the hierarchy instead of like duplicating things. So like right now, to top level group, all of the milestones from child groups and projects will roll up to that top level milestone. But if I have an issue attached to a milestone in the top level group, I have to traverse outside of my project to go way up into that group to look at that milestone. Whereas I should just be able to see that milestone and whatever like issues are part of it there. So I completely am on board with the stuff that you presented, Alex. I think I don't have a strong opinion on how we solve it technically, but like they're essentially the same thing that have slightly different things in each of them, and it makes it really confusing. And so if we can combine them and call it whatever we want, like I don't even know if we need to have a project, and I don't know in this example, like the last sided group will be a collection of people, a team. Yes, that's very true. But they also want resources there because they want to separate their issue management from their repository management, right? They have like a bunch of microservices.
Sorry, yeah. What I meant by sort of this area here is that I think that the project and group would technically mean the same thing, but I think they would be used sort of interchangeably. So yeah, groups. I think, yeah. So I agree with you. I don't think there's a need for a project, but I think if you're talking about the system to people, I think you kind of need to talk in sometimes in terms of projects, because it's sort of more natural in some contexts.
Would there be an opportunity, do you think, to eventually call the one thing something else? It's like a little bit more. No, container is not user friendly, but like a workspace or a.
Oh, I like that workspace.
You know, like it's a place where you can do work and collaborate on any resource, and any resource can live in it. Right.
And under the hood, the common element. I'm still sharing. Great. So yeah, under the hood, the common element is this namespace. And so right now, sort of what I've tried to address is, I guess I'm still asking questions rather than trying to sort of find solutions.
Sure.
And trying to sort of define the problem, I guess. And I think there's namespace is kind of key, because I haven't talked about how a user is associated with projects, and how a user could own a wiki, or there's personal snippets and so on. And that all that stuff, I think, belongs within a namespace. And yeah, I've laid it out in other places, but yeah, I think namespace is that common thing you're thinking of.
Yeah, I think it is too.
So yeah, I think the starting from scratch, it would be easy enough to model this. It's quite a different challenge to get there, though, to iterate through to that position. I don't know how these sort of working groups progress through that sort of that process, or sort of how we want to go forward with this, if everybody's kind of in agreement with what we're looking at and what we're trying to achieve. I don't know what sort of I don't know how to.
I guess
that exit criteria.
Yeah, a question like what do we want to achieve like out of that? Is that, so I think clearly, like from my perspective, from like an engineering point of view, there's value in simplifying these things. That will naturally, I guess, remove some of the product complexity. It will make it easier, hopefully, to implement things cross-purpose. But as part of the working group, or as part of like vision for this, do we also want to see like visible product changes? So I guess to your point, Gabe, like, is there a intent to kind of have a different name, to have, like, for example, I don't know whether it's a user-friendly term, but namespaces? Is there like an intent to replace groups and projects with a new term from a product perspective, so from a user facing perspective?
I think that we should probably work with UX and do some research and validation around that separately from the technical piece. So I think Mike is out this week, but I'll follow up with them next week and we can get that scheduled out. I think if we were to move to call it something else, it would be a long-term play, just because we have so much documentation, so much code. So, you know, it might be a goal to get there by 14.0, you know, if we really want to do that as a team and a company. I think there's lots of things we can do in the interim and figuring out how we want to get there. The current most immediate thing that we should solve with this working group is have a plan to get there and a vision that the company buys into, and have a clear technical path and like interim steps to iterate there. Because right now folks are just like duplicating code and dumping things into groups because that's the construct that we have, and we as a team and as a company haven't provided a better alternative or way that they should be doing things. And so the path of least resistance is just keep adding in. So I think we need to at least provide some sort of technical changes to the point where they know where to add things in, so that we're not like exacerbating the problem. If that makes sense.
It does, yes. Yeah.
So then on that note, I think this is great. Thank you, Alex, for sharing. I think step one is to figure out what that vision is, and like longer term, how do we get there? And then we can start breaking it down into potential iterations and MVCs. So what might that look like to sort that out?
Well, I think going back to the epic that I wrote, and I'll just share my screen and talk through that real quick. So we kind of understand what the problem is, but going down kind of into the proposal, we'll call it something else besides a container, right? But I think the thing is we have a couple different things that don't necessarily belong in a container or a namespace. We'll just call it namespace. Like to-dos don't really seem like they should belong in the namespace. I don't know if they do. We're also going to have to think about admin and that sort of thing. But if we want to, like, it feels like we can call this something else or what it should be, then we can. But the vision is just to make it so all these resources that we talked about can live within a namespace. And then we really nail the piece of how does inheritance work for these different things from beyond just a permission standpoint, but how are resources surfaced in children and parents? How do things roll up and down? And then how do you share resources across these kind of namespaces? So one of the things that is a common use case, if you have one hierarchy of namespaces that is your resources that you, maybe it's your repositories or your issue manager or whatever it is, and then you have another hierarchy that is your teams and they want to manage their issues there. How do you share specific things across so that they show up in both places without you having to leave the context of your team to go look at a resource that is canonically owned by another namespace? That's like a common problem that a lot of our customers have asked us to solve. And a good use case is we have our teams organized in this group hierarchy, but then we also have like this shared services group over here that has a bunch of microservices that all these different teams use. Like how can we have them so that they can see the issues they need to work on from those services inside of their team issue tracker? And one of the things that I was thinking about that also could help is thinking about namespaces as having unique prefixes. So it's easier to see, like if I were to share assign an issue from one namespace to a sibling namespace, how should that show up in a way that it's easy to understand where something comes from? And we can get in all those semantics, but this is kind of the basic vision. And then when you go in to create a namespace, you definitely need better UI and UX design here. But the idea is you kind of define what you want to use it for, and everything can be turned on and off, right? So right now, if I turn a repository off in my project, I still see like I think I still see merge requests or security tabs or a bunch of things that shouldn't be there because I'm not using that resource in my project. And so I think that's where we want to make it modular enough so that if you want to use it for just issue management, you're not overburdened by seeing a bunch of things that you shouldn't see because they're not applicable to that namespace. But it should also be just easy if I then want to use that in the future, I can just turn on and it's there. The resource is available to me. This will make it so that, like, stepping back a little bit, you could have a whole set of namespaces in Children that are just wikis. You could have a whole set of namespaces that are just design management, right? If you want to organize things that way. You could have a whole hierarchy of namespaces that's just repos. You could mix and match everything together. It really like gives the power to the end user to decide how they want to structure things. And if we can get that modular, we can also come up with like different recipes. So if you want to get started with GitLab, you know, pick this predefined like setup for your namespaces, and we'll generate that scaffolding for you and all the base resources, and kind of making it easy to onboard, because that's also where people get tripped up, is they don't know how to set things up in the right way, and they spend 2 weeks reading through documentation and being really frustrated about it. So whatever the common patterns are, whether you do microservices or mono repos or whatever, just making it really easy to spin up GitLab with a little amount of friction. So that's,
so Gabe,
yeah.
From product perspective, I mean, is there a potential outcome of this direction that like the whole sort of paradigm is overhauled?
In what sense?
That you said that, you know, you'd be open to sort of, or I think you even said that you think that projects like kind of don't make sense, that, and we'd sort of amalgamate everything, we'd come up with a new name. Presumably along with all that sort of that process, it would be like a complete rethink of kind of how things work sort of within GitLab. It's a major change.
Yeah.
Is that kind of what product is thinking the direction would be, that it's not, you know, that there is sort of a push to head in a like take quite a big step at some point and kind of rethink how the system operates?
I would like to, part of this working group is to validate that is indeed what we should or shouldn't do. I think if we were to change nothing else, the smallest MVC we could do is sort of like what you suggested, where you have a project and you have a group, and they're just names that we leave and we don't change them. But you have behind the scenes, they're all just groups that have a project that is owned by that group or whatever.
Like the project's kind of invisible, and the group sort of sits in front of it.
Yeah, I think what we need to solve for the end users first is making it so that you don't have to duplicate things at the group level. So we have issues there. We have wikis, we have design management. You can use that within epics. And essentially making it so that you could have epics in what are now projects, and really just parity between a group and a project would be the first step without going and changing anything crazy, right? I think that would be a good MVC to shoot for. And then from there, we can, because that's like a known quantity, and we're not changing how the product is marketed or sold or anything. We're just making it so that if we want to go that direction, it's easy to do that, to kind of make things more extensible later. But if we accomplish that and then do all the cleanup to where when you create a group or a project or a namespace, you can select what you want to use and what you don't want to use, and kind of really like nail that, and then nail how things roll up and down the hierarchy. Like that is, without changing the name of a group or a project, we can accomplish all of that. And that's definitely something we ought to do from product that I've heard time and time again.
So if So for example, at the moment, we've got project members, we've got group members. If we at some point run this sort of parallel system where we kind of have a group with this sort of hidden project behind it, and we kind of make a move where we say, all right, project members are not a thing anymore. Everything's done through group membership. Is that acceptable? And how does that sort of like play out in terms of, you know, the roadmap, or because it seems like it's quite a significant change to me, but I think it's not a bad one, but it's obviously quite a big change.
Well,
maybe not in the code, by the way, just more from sort of a product perspective.
Well, that's where we don't necessarily need to tell, like, we can change the UI if we want, but I think that's a separate track, because technically if you make a project right now, what we call a project, a group, right? And we still call it a project, but it's really a group. And then you make a group, have a project inside of it that is behind the scenes. You now have, they're essentially, we can still call them projects, but we know they're groups. And I'm also fine if we move away from that in terms of membership. It's the same thing that how it works now. You have a group that has members, projects. You can add a member to a project that's not part of the parent group. You can inherit members from the parent group down to the project. I don't see how it is would be different from how the system currently works.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. I
was going to add too that from research, our users don't actually know the difference between groups and projects often. They get really lost. So if we abstract this for them, they probably won't know the difference in a lot of cases.
Okay, so I think there's probably a first step where, at least in engineering terms, we could potentially change things under the hood and no one would sort of know. That could be sort of a first step as an engineering approach, I guess.
Well, what would be helpful? I mean, we can go and do we can do a lot of customer discovery and have discussions with them, but it feels like those discussions would largely just be around what would you call it, right?
Yeah.
It's not that they don't want to be able to create issues at the group level right now, or epics at the project level, or inherit things down from parents, or have things roll up from children, like, or share things from siblings. Like, those are all known problems that have pretty much been validated. Like, that's why we went through the problem validation that we did before this working group. So those are all things that exist that we need to solve. I think it comes down to, how do we solve that? You can do things engineering first approach, but can we set it up to where, like, what decisions do we need to make now that would impact the engineering approach from like a UX standpoint?
We're at time. I was going to suggest, I think, both to answer Gabe's question and then just capture this. I'm happy to start it, but can we put this potential MVC that we just talked about in an issue, and we can link it to Gabe's Epic or something? So that way we can capture it. I can start it if that's helpful. And then we can continue the conversation asynchronous and then dig into more details next week. So if someone wants to raise their hand, we can assign it, but I'm happy to like stub out the issue and add all of you, and then let the rest of you really contribute to it and add the detail, if that works. I just said it, so I'll do that. And then later on over the next week, you guys can add to it. So, okay. Thanks everyone. Great day today, and have a good weekend, long weekend. Family and friends day tomorrow. See ya.
Right. Thank you. Bye.